Primitives of Progress, the invariants that shape people, capital, and nations. Summary statement. Progress can be understood by identifying recurring structural relationships that survive transplantation across different domains, beginning with a specific pinpoint position, expanding through its contextual cloud of conditions, limits, and counterexamples, and finally distilling the underlying invariant. The framework separates local observations from the more general principles beneath them. Apparent binaries are useful instruments of comparison rather than universal truths, while the rule of priority, where applicable, provides an asymmetric ordering principle. Protect the essential downside before opening exposure to uncertain upside. Secure the floor, then open the ceiling. The objective is not to construct a universal explanation of everything, but to identify the deepest useful invariants that improve our understanding of how people, institutions, capital, and nations adapt, endure, and progress. Section 1. Beneath the surface of progress. Different disciplines frequently appear to describe entirely different worlds. Psychology speaks of motivation and agency. Finance speaks of capital, ownership, and obligation. Economics speaks of productivity and growth. Biology speaks of survival and adaptation. Organizations speak of execution and innovation. Mythology and storytelling speak of heroes, trials, and transformation. Each field develops its own vocabulary because each is observing a different domain. Yet occasionally, beneath those differences, a familiar structural relationship appears. The temptation is to immediately declare that the two things are the same. They are not. A psychological state is not a financial contract. A biological adaptation is not an economic policy. A character responding to an inciting incident is not equivalent to a borrower servicing debt. To treat these things as interchangeable would be to confuse metaphor with mechanism, to commit what might be called state incommensurability. But a more careful question remains available. Can different domains contain relationships that are structurally similar, even though the objects themselves are fundamentally different? That is the starting point of primitives of progress. The objective is not to construct a theory capable of explaining everything. Such theories often explain nothing precisely because they abstract away every meaningful distinction. The objective is narrower: to identify recurring structural relationships, test whether they survive transplantation between domains, and determine where their explanatory power ends. A simple three-tier architecture provides the method. At the top is the pinpoint position, a narrow, preferably domain-specific observation. Beneath it is the contextual cloud, the surrounding conditions, alternatives, limits, counterexamples, and parameters that determine when the observation is useful. At the base is the invariant, the more general relationship that remains after the domain-specific material has been stripped away. The movement is therefore from observation through context toward distillation, and one of the simplest places to begin is human motivation. 2. The starting point, the problem of human motivation. Popular stories contain a curious recurring pattern. The hero frequently does not begin the journey voluntarily. Luke Skywalker initially dreams of leaving Tatooine, but remains bound to his ordinary life until the Empire murders his aunt and uncle. Katniss Everdeen enters the Hunger Games because her sister is selected. Neo's ordinary existence is disrupted by forces already searching for him. Frodo inherits a burden whose consequences steadily make remaining at home impossible. The device is so common that storytelling gives it a name: the inciting incident. Something happens. The existing equilibrium breaks. The protagonist must move. Jason Pargin drew attention to the psychological significance of this pattern. Perhaps part of the fantasy is not merely that an ordinary person gets to have an extraordinary adventure. Perhaps it is that circumstances finally provide that person with sufficient permission or sufficient pressure to leave ordinary life behind. That gives us an initial pinpoint position. A person who depends entirely on external motivation cannot reliably generate forward movement when that external stimulus disappears. This is deliberately narrow. It concerns human agency. It says nothing yet about finance, economics, or civilization. The apparent solution is obvious. Become self-motivated. Develop curiosity. Generate your own objectives. Become willing to enter unfamiliar environments without requiring somebody else to push you. Ask questions. Explore. Become, in the broadest sense, a truth seeker. someone willing to turn over the stone simply because there might be something underneath it. Yet context expansion immediately exposes a problem. We can construct the opposite pinpoint position. A person who relies exclusively upon self-motivation risks ignoring valuable external signals, opportunities, constraints, and catalysts. Suddenly, the original answer is insufficient. External motivation is not necessarily a defect. A crisis can reveal information we had previously ignored. Another person can expose us to an opportunity we could not have discovered alone. Failure can force reconsideration. Competition can raise performance. An unexpected event can redirect an entire life. Even Bilbo Baggins, one of the more naturally adventurous hobbits, does not simply wake one morning and independently decide to cross Middle-earth. In The Hobbit, or There and Back Again, Gandalf and the arrival of Thorin's company provide substantial external stimulus. What is distinctive about Bilbo is partly what happens after that stimulus encounters something already present within him. The binary therefore becomes more interesting: self-motivation versus external motivation. And rather than choosing a winner, we can begin examining what each side actually does. 3. The contextual cloud. Breaking the binary open. Self-motivation provides important advantages. It creates continuity. The individual does not require a crisis, manager, rival, deadline, or catastrophe every time movement becomes necessary. Curiosity can generate its own direction. Internal agency reduces dependence upon environmental conditions. But external motivation provides something equally important: information from outside the self. Reality can tell us things our internal model cannot. An external shock can reveal that our assumptions were wrong. Another person can introduce information unavailable to us. A changing environment can make yesterday's successful strategy obsolete. Complete dependence on external motivation therefore creates fragility. But complete rejection of external motivation creates blindness. The apparent duality begins dissolving. The more capable individual is neither the perfectly independent hero nor the permanently reactive hero. It is the person capable of processing both sources. This is where inquisitiveness becomes more important than the original distinction. An external stimulus occurs. The inquisitive person asks, "What does this mean?" An internal doubt appears. The same person asks, "Why do I believe this?" An opportunity emerges. What happens if I investigate it? An established belief encounters contradictory evidence. What would prove me wrong? The question becomes a conversion mechanism. Stimulus, question, investigation, understanding, agency, action. The stimulus can originate internally or externally. What matters is what happens next. This also resolves an apparent conflict between adaptive survival and conscious inquiry. Human beings possess enormous numbers of automatic mechanisms that allow us to operate without continually reconstructing reality from first principles. Habits, heuristics, conventions, and routines reduce cognitive load. They provide a functional baseline. But the same mechanisms can become traps when conditions change. Conscious inquiry performs another function. It interrupts automatic behavior when necessary and asks whether the inherited model still corresponds to reality. Neither alone is sufficient. A person who questions everything but never acts becomes trapped in the action gap, endless inquiry without execution. A person who executes relentlessly but never questions becomes highly efficient at reproducing yesterday's solution, even after yesterday's solution has stopped working. This gives us the first major lesson of the framework. The purpose of examining a binary is not necessarily to choose one side. The contrast may exist primarily to reveal the limitations of both. Once those limitations become visible, we can ask the question that moves us from the contextual cloud into the base layer. What survives when the distinction itself is removed? Section 4. Distilling the first invariant, converting stimulus into action. The answer is surprisingly simple. The important distinction was never ultimately between internal and external motivation. Both are sources of stimulus. The higher order capability is the ability to convert available stimulus into purposeful movement. The first invariant can therefore be stated: progress depends upon the capacity to convert available stimulus into purposeful action, regardless of whether the stimulus originates internally or externally. This supersedes the original pinpoint position, and that is important. The purpose of context expansion is not to prove that the original observation was correct. Sometimes the contextual cloud should reveal that the pinpoint position was merely a locally valid expression of something deeper. The robust individual does not say, I must motivate myself, nor something must motivate me. The more general capability is, whatever useful stimulus becomes available, I can process it into information, exercise agency over my response, and convert it into deliberate action. Self-motivation remains valuable because it protects the individual's capacity to move when external stimulus disappears. External motivation remains valuable because no individual possesses complete information about reality. Inquisitiveness connects the two, and agency converts them into action. The original binary has therefore done its work. We no longer need to choose between its two sides. We have extracted something underneath them. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Primitives of Progress, the Invariants that Shape People, Capital, and Nations. Part 2 of 3. Section 5, From Dualities to Cross-Domain Invariants. The motivational example reveals something important about the method itself. Human beings naturally perceive through contrast. Hot becomes intelligible against cold. Scarcity becomes visible against abundance. Centralization becomes easier to understand beside decentralization. Self-motivation becomes clearer when placed beside external motivation. Dualities are therefore useful analytical instruments. But that does not mean reality itself necessarily arrives organized into pairs. A binary can be a tool of observation rather than a fundamental property of the thing being observed. This distinction matters because the next temptation is to discover a similar-looking binary somewhere else and declare that the two are manifestations of the same thing. That is where the framework must impose discipline upon itself. Consider finance. At first glance, the distinction between equity financing and debt financing appears to rhyme with the distinction between self-motivation and external motivation. Equity seems internally attached to the fortunes of the enterprise, whereas debt imposes an externally specified repayment obligation. The resemblance is attractive, but taken literally, it fails. A psychological orientation and a financial contract occupy fundamentally different state spaces. Debt is a legal claim. Equity is an ownership interest. Motivation is a psychological condition. An external crisis forcing someone to act is not equivalent to a creditor holding a senior claim against cash flow. The comparison becomes metaphorical rather than mechanical. This is state incommensurability. Recognizing it provides an important safeguard. Cross-domain analysis must compare relationships without pretending that the objects participating in those relationships are identical. The framework can therefore distinguish three concepts. A primitive is a fundamental building block within a system. A duality is a comparative lens through which contrasting properties become easier to observe. An invariant is a structural relationship that remains recognizable under a defined transformation or transplantation. The distinction is crucial. We cannot simply announce an invariant because two descriptions sound alike. We must first identify precisely what relationship is supposedly being preserved, then ask whether that relationship continues to function when the domain changes. This transforms cross-domain comparison from a literary exercise into a hypothesis. The question becomes, what exactly survived the transplantation? If the answer is merely the wording, we have discovered a metaphor. If an operational relationship survives, we may have found an invariant. Section 6. Capital. A second testing ground. Finance provides a useful environment in which to test this discipline. The conventional distinction is between equity financing and debt financing. Under equity financing, capital is supplied in exchange for an ownership interest. The investor participates in the residual outcome of the enterprise. If the venture performs exceptionally well, the investor may participate substantially in that upside. If it performs badly, the value of the investment can fall dramatically or disappear altogether. Debt establishes a different relationship. Capital is advanced subject to a repayment obligation. The creditor generally does not acquire the unlimited residual upside of the enterprise. Instead, the creditor receives a contractual claim to repayment according to specified terms. The borrower must attempt to service that obligation regardless of whether the project financed by the debt ultimately performs as expected. Neither structure is inherently good or bad. They distribute risk differently, they distribute upside differently, and they behave differently under stress. This becomes particularly important when examining credit creation. It is easy to mistake the expansion of financial capacity for the expansion of productive capacity. Credit can increase purchasing power immediately. It can mobilize resources that would otherwise remain idle. It can allow a viable enterprise to acquire machinery today rather than waiting years to accumulate the necessary savings. But the creation of credit is not itself the creation of the machinery, the skilled worker, the electricity, the factory, the software, or the final product. This is where the fertilizer analogy becomes useful. Credit is like fertilizer, potentially powerful but valuable principally through the productive system to which it is applied. Fertilizer is not the crop. It can increase the productive capacity of viable soil, but it cannot substitute for the seed, water, sunlight, nutrients, labor, or biological process required to produce the harvest. And there is a further refinement. More fertilizer does not imply proportionately more food. At some point, the system reaches its absorptive capacity. Beyond that point, additional input may generate diminishing returns or even damage the productive substrate. Finance exhibits a comparable limitation. Additional credit directed toward productive capacity can accelerate development. Credit can fund factories, infrastructure, scientific research, education, and technologies that would otherwise take much longer to build. It can even change the productive frontier itself. Speculative booms sometimes leave behind valuable infrastructure despite destroying large amounts of financial capital. Railway manias built railways. Telecommunications bubbles laid fiber. Venture booms sometimes finance technologies whose eventual social value exceeds the returns captured by the original investors. Credit, therefore, does more than passively fertilize an existing economy. Under some conditions, it can help reconfigure the soil, but the constraint remains. Financial claims cannot indefinitely outrun the economy's capacity to convert those claims into productive reality. When they do, the discrepancy must appear somewhere. Inflation, asset price appreciation, declining capital efficiency, malinvestment, defaults, financial instability, or some combination of them. The deeper lesson is therefore not that credit is bad, nor that slower financing is inherently superior. It is, financial acceleration is valuable only to the extent that the underlying system can transform additional claims on resources into additional productive capacity. The metric is not the reality. The financing mechanism is not the output. The catalyst must ultimately encounter a productive process. Section 7, Natural Constraints and the Problem of Forced Growth. This introduces another dimension of the original discussion. Some processes contain unavoidable gestation periods. Capital can accelerate the construction of a factory, but money cannot instantaneously create experienced engineers. Investment can expand energy infrastructure, but a power station still has to be designed, permitted, constructed, and connected. Education can be heavily funded, but expertise still requires time to develop. The familiar Warren Buffett observation captures the intuition. 9 women cannot collectively produce 1 baby in a month. The point is not that economies possess a universal fixed growth rate. They do not. Developing economies can grow extremely rapidly as workers move into more productive sectors, existing technologies are adopted, and infrastructure is built. Mature economies generally face different constraints. The deeper principle concerns irreducible process time. Finance can remove a shortage of capital. It cannot necessarily remove every other bottleneck simultaneously. This creates an important distinction between financial speed and productive speed. If financial capacity expands faster than productive capacity can respond, monetary claims begin competing for resources whose physical availability has not increased at the same rate. The attempt to accelerate reality through the metric eventually encounters reality itself. This insight changes the question policymakers, companies, and investors should ask. Not simply, how much capital can we deploy? But, how much additional capital can this system productively absorb at this moment? That is a fundamentally different optimization problem. 8. The rule of priority. Secure the floor, open the ceiling. The earlier discussion of motivation produced another pattern. Consider 2 criticisms of inquisitive truth-seeking. First, inquiry without execution can produce the action gap. A person, institution, or civilization may understand enormously and nevertheless fail to convert knowledge into material capability. Second, pure execution without inquiry creates the opposite vulnerability. A system becomes exceptionally good at repeating what already works, but increasingly incapable of recognizing when its environment has changed. At first, these appear to be another simple binary, execution versus inquiry. But once again, choosing one side is the wrong operation. Execution provides continuity, inquiry provides adaptation. One protects the functioning system, the other searches beyond its existing limits. A similar relationship appears between automatic survival behavior and conscious inquiry. Habit, routine, and heuristic behavior allow human beings to function without subjecting every action to expensive conscious analysis. But conscious inquiry provides the capacity to interrupt those routines when they cease to correspond with reality. This is where the rule of priority enters. It does not necessarily constitute another tier of the Pinpoint Contextual Cloud invariant architecture. It functions instead as an ordering operator when the structure under examination contains asymmetric risks. Its basic formulation is, protect what cannot safely be lost before pursuing what can beneficially be gained. Or more compactly, open quote, secure the floor. Open the ceiling, close quote. This is not a prescription for timid behavior. Quite the opposite. Protecting the existential floor can create the freedom to become considerably more aggressive with everything above it. The logic resembles Nassim Nicholas Taleb's barbell approach to risk. Avoid exposure capable of causing ruin while maintaining access to uncertain opportunities with potentially large upside. A related structure appears in the explore versus exploit problem. Exploit what is already known well enough to sustain the system. Explore sufficiently to discover what may sustain it tomorrow. Organizational theory encounters the same challenge through the idea of ambidexterity. Established operations must continue executing efficiently while exploratory units investigate technologies, products, and business models that may eventually replace them. The rule of priority, therefore, does not demand a comfortable midpoint between preservation and exploration. It establishes an asymmetry, protects survival strongly, explore upside expansively. Applied to our original motivational problem, this gives us floor, develop sufficient internal agency that movement does not cease when external motivation disappears. Ceiling, remain receptive to external catalysts capable of correcting, accelerating, or redirecting that movement. The result is not independence from the environment, it is robust participation within it. And this leads directly to the next question. If this asymmetric structure keeps appearing in different domains, are we looking at a clever human strategy or something deeper? This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Primitives of Progress, the Invariants that Shape People, Capital, and Nations. Part 3 of 3. Section 9. Strategy or invariant? The boundary erasure test. The distinction between a successful strategy and a genuine invariant is critical. A strategy presupposes an actor capable of choosing between alternatives. It tells the actor what might be advantageous to do. An invariant, by contrast, should not depend upon somebody consciously understanding it. It describes a structural relationship that remains recognizable despite a specified transformation. This suggests a useful test. Open quote, remove the conscious decision maker. Does the structural relationship remain? Close quote. Call this the boundary erasure test. Consider biological evolution. An organism does not need to understand risk management. It does not deliberately construct a barbell strategy or consciously decide to preserve essential functions while experimenting at the margins. Variation occurs. Selection follows. Changes that catastrophically compromise essential functions tend to disappear because the organisms carrying them fail to reproduce. Other variations may open access to new resources, environments, or capabilities. What remains after repeated selection can therefore appear remarkably strategic, even though no strategist designed it. The implication is intriguing. A relationship may operate as a constraint at one level and appear as a strategy at another. Humans observe the recurring structure, consciously reproduce it, and give it names: risk management, optionality, exploration versus exploitation, organizational ambidexterity, the barbell strategy, or the rule of priority. The conscious strategy may therefore be an attempt to align behavior with a deeper selection pressure. But caution is necessary. Finding analogous structures in biology, economics, and organizations does not automatically establish a universal law. Claims about physics or thermodynamics require especially strong evidence. A compelling metaphor is not enough. The appropriate conclusion is therefore provisional. The rule of priority is a candidate cross-domain invariant, a recurring asymmetric relationship in which preservation of essential viability enables continued exposure to uncertain upside. That statement can be tested. It can also fail, and that is precisely what makes it useful. Section 10. Selection, Survival, and the Asymmetric Engine. Seen through this lens, progress begins to resemble an asymmetric engine. One side preserves the ability to continue, the other side searches for something better. We can express the relationship simply as a secure foundation plus continued exploration creates the capacity to adapt. The ordering matters. A system that destroys itself while exploring receives no benefit from whatever it might eventually have discovered. This is why ruin occupies a special position. Many ordinary losses are recoverable. An experiment can fail. A company can discontinue a product. A scientist can reject a hypothesis. An individual can change direction, but an irreversible loss eliminates future optionality. The first priority is therefore not the elimination of all risk. Such a system would rapidly become incapable of adaptation. The objective is to protect the system from risks that terminate its ability to continue experimenting. Once that floor exists, experimentation becomes possible. This resolves part of the apparent conflict between survival and inquisitiveness. Adaptive survival provides continuity. Inquiry prevents continuity from becoming stagnation. Execution converts knowledge into reality. Feedback reveals whether the result actually worked. The complete structure therefore looks less like a binary and more like a loop. Preserve, explore, act, observe, learn, adapt, preserve. Each successful cycle modifies the starting condition of the next. Progress is not simply expansion. It is adaptive iteration without ruin. This also explains why efficiency matters. A system that continuously requires more resources merely to maintain the same useful output is not necessarily progressing. A system that learns to produce more useful output from fewer inputs expands the resources available for further experimentation. Efficiency strengthens the floor and enlarges the frontier simultaneously. Section 11. From people to institutions and nations. The same analytical procedure can now be applied at larger scales, but without pretending that the mechanisms are identical. An individual needs sufficient continuity to survive while retaining the capacity to question and change. A company needs functioning operations and cash flow while preserving room for experimentation. A financial system must mobilize capital without allowing financial claims to expand so far beyond productive capacity that the system becomes unstable. A nation must preserve essential infrastructure, energy, food, security, and institutional continuity while remaining capable of technological, economic, and organizational adaptation. The objects change, the mechanisms change, the legal structures change, the relevant timescales change. Therefore, none should simply be equated with another. What can be tested is whether a relationship survives those transformations. This is where ideology becomes less useful as the first analytical question. Capitalism versus socialism, state versus market, equity versus debt, centralization versus decentralization, exploration versus exploitation. These categories can illuminate important differences, but they can also encourage the analyst to choose a camp before understanding the mechanism. Deng Xiaoping's famous cat formulation captures the pragmatic alternative. Whether the cat is black or white matters less than whether it catches mice. That does not mean values disappear. A society must still decide what outcomes it considers desirable, what losses are unacceptable, whose interests matter, and what constitutes progress. Those are normative questions, and no mechanical framework can answer them automatically. But once an objective has been selected, another question becomes available. Which mechanism is structurally best suited to this particular problem? Markets may excel at distributed discovery. States may be better positioned to provide certain public goods or protect strategic capabilities. Debt may be appropriate where predictable cash flows can support fixed obligations. Equity may be better suited to uncertain ventures, where risks and outcomes should remain more closely coupled. The rule of priority does not tell society what it ought ultimately to value. It asks whether the mechanisms being used preserve the prerequisites necessary to pursue those values over time. This is the distinction between purpose and mechanics. Purpose establishes the destination. Mechanics determine whether the vehicle can get there. Section 12, the stopping rule, avoiding a theory of everything. Once cross-domain invariants become visible, another danger emerges. Abstraction becomes addictive. Motivation can be reduced to agency. Agency can be reduced to adaptation. Adaptation can be reduced to survival. Survival can be reduced to energy. Energy can be reduced to physics. Continue long enough and every discussion eventually arrives at fundamental particles and thermodynamics. The explanation becomes increasingly universal and increasingly useless. If everything is ultimately about energy, saying that something is about energy distinguishes almost nothing. The framework, therefore, requires a stopping rule. Never descend merely because further abstraction is possible. Descend only when the next level explains something the invariant itself cannot. The objective is not to discover the deepest imaginable principle. It is to discover the deepest useful invariant. A good invariant should retain enough abstraction to travel between appropriate domains, while retaining enough structure to exclude cases where it does not apply. That second requirement is essential. A theory that cannot tell us when it is wrong has ceased to be an analytical instrument. This is also why context expansion should sometimes end without discovering an invariant. Perhaps two domains merely resemble one another metaphorically. Perhaps the transformation destroys the relevant relationship. Perhaps an apparent duality turns out to contain 3, 4, or 10 independent mechanisms. Those are successful outcomes. The methodology should reward rejection as much as confirmation. Otherwise, it becomes an engine for manufacturing patterns rather than discovering them. Section 13, Conclusion. Progress as disciplined adaptation. The journey began with a deceptively simple observation about heroes. Why do so many protagonists require something to happen before they move? The initial answer seemed to concern self-motivation. Perhaps the superior individual is simply the person who does not need to be pushed. Context expansion complicated that conclusion. External motivation contains information. Crisis can reveal reality. Other people can expose opportunities. Environmental change can force reconsideration. Complete independence from external stimulus would therefore be another form of fragility. The deeper principle became, progress depends upon the capacity to convert available stimulus into purposeful action, regardless of whether the stimulus originates internally or externally. From there, the investigation expanded. Dualities proved useful for exposing differences, but unreliable as descriptions of reality itself. Cross-domain comparison required protection against state incommensurability. Finance demonstrated the distinction between expanding claims and expanding productive capacity. The action gap exposed the limitations of inquiry without execution. Pure execution revealed the opposite danger, efficiency without adaptation. And through those contrasts emerged a candidate asymmetric invariant. Protect what cannot safely be lost before pursuing what can beneficially be gained. Secure the floor. Open the ceiling. That is the rule of priority. But even this conclusion must remain subject to the methodology that produced it. It should not be accepted because it sounds elegant. It should be transplanted, challenged, bounded, wherever possible, falsified. The architecture therefore remains deliberately simple. Pinpoint position, a specific observation. Contextual cloud. The conditions, alternatives, parameters, counterexamples, and limits surrounding it. Invariant. The deepest useful relationship that survives once the domain-specific material has been removed. The purpose is not to make psychology look like finance look like biology, or nations look like individuals. It is precisely the opposite. The purpose is to preserve their differences while discovering which structural relationships genuinely remain intact when everything that does not survive transplantation has been stripped away. That is where metaphor ends, and where the search for invariance begins.